I don't generally think about public policy through the gender lens, similar to what Arpita mentioned earlier. And it's only when people decide that they want to invite me for a panel because we want you as a woman, then only do I realize that, oh yes, I am in fact a woman. And that is sometimes rather insulting because would you not have invited me if I was not a woman? Some comments that have come my way in my career are things like, you cannot be too intelligent. You cannot become too intelligent. Men will be intimidated by you. How are you going to find a man to marry you? Okay. So I'm not sure if these sort of statements resonate with any women here today, or certainly women who want to progress in their careers would face at least, even if they're not spoken directly, indirectly through family members and close friends of yours. When I decided to participate in this panel, I think similar to our other members of the panel, we discussed yesterday that it's quite unusual to have a session on women in a Liberty Forum such as this, because it actually puts us into a certain category that makes us very uncomfortable and awkward in a way. But nevertheless, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. In the context of Malaysia specifically, I tried to look at some unique observations that I could share with you as the audience. And so all I'm doing is giving you some trends and observations, and hopefully this will shed some light on the topic. So I realized that not everyone knows the makeup of Malaysia, so I'm just going into very, very basic issues here. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, and 60% Malays is the majority, and they also form the Muslim majority of the country. 22% Chinese, that's me, I'm a Chinese Malaysian. Largely Buddhist for the Chinese speaking, and if you're English speaking, you're largely Christian, and you have 7% of Indians, which are largely Hindu. And the reason I put this out here is because obviously culture, race, and religion very, very much influence our views and perception of women. We have had very politicized race issues in the country. So we had race-based affirmative action policy for the Malay majority starting in 1971 to elevate the status of the economically poor Malays. It has not stopped till today. There's still very much a favoring of ethnicity over meritocracy. That also influences how we view women who are capable. And this policy has had tremendous impact on both public and private sectors. Religion, we don't talk so much about this, but I think it's important to bring this up because it definitely does set the cultural context. And I think it is the same case as many countries here in South Asia. So we have a ruling coalition made up of 3 race-based parties, and the Malay party is the strongest. We have an opposition coalition made up of 3 parties, including the Islamic Party. And I say this because we have a great competition between the Malay and the Islamic Party, and they compete for this religious space, which is basically the majority vote in the country, the Malays, who are also equal to being Muslim. And finally, maybe some short notes on the economy. It is a growing economy, but it is also stuck in this vaguely defined middle income trap. Yes, we do quite well in economic freedom, but our GDP growth is just average, bumbling along after the Asian economic crisis. And as cost of living increases, government subsidies have fallen, which is a good thing in my opinion, but because of that, that also necessitates dual income households. So that's just the background, just setting the tone for you. So talking about women in the workforce, which I believe is very strongly related to liberal values. Someone mentioned, I believe, Parth earlier, that education does not necessarily mean that women are going to participate in the liberal movement, and I'm going to show you some statistics. So women form 49% of the population, but our labor force participation is extremely low. You would not expect that in a country like Malaysia. Compared to other ASEAN countries like Singapore and Thailand, you can see we are right at the bottom there with the little red bar. So this shows you that women are more highly qualified in Malaysia. More women attend universities, more women are enrolled. We tend to go further in our studies than men, but this is not necessarily matched by our labor force participation rates. And this is also unique in Malaysia. If you look at the bottom chart, our labor force participation is very high, but then it drops steadily and it does not rise again. And this is quite unlike some other ASEAN countries where as women bear children, have families, they eventually return to the workforce. But this is not the case in Malaysia. Okay, just a short slide also to show you that women are, we have relatively low participation in politics in ASEAN. We only form about 10% of all elected parliamentarians and state assembly persons. In a research study that I did with someone else, an academic, we also found that women in politics feel they have to fight harder to prove their significance and worth in a male-dominated governance structure. So why is this the case? I'd like to just make two other observations. One is that there are changing roles of women in society, and third, on religious conservatism. Women play different roles according to which ethnicity and religion community they're part of. So in Malaysia, it's rather multi-layered. Unless you come to the country, you really understand how people perceive each other. People from either Malay, Chinese, or the Indian ethnicities. These traditional values are often in conflict with modern living. So, like I said earlier, the dual incomes which are needed. How the different races are treated also affects women. I talked about how affirmative action is in place in the country. So I'll give you an example. When race-based affirmative action came into place in Malaysia, this greatly increased the presence of Malays, which are what we call the Bumi Putra. In direct translation would be the princess of the soil, the princess of the earth. And the intention was to increase the Malay participation in the public sector, which therefore also pushed the non-Malay women outside. And as such, non-Malay women predominantly have to choose to work in the private sector, and this has implications on the sort of roles and perceptions that they next assume. I won't go into the theoretical and philosophical backdrop of religious conservatism, but in Malaysia, it's not so much about Islam any longer than it is about state coercion, the state trying to rein in power. So these are just some examples that have happened in the last few years as to how the state has sort of increased its control over women and how this has affected women's rights as well. I'd like to highlight the second point, where a woman who actually applied to work in a school, she was suspended because the Ministry of Education eventually found out that she was pregnant and therefore lifted her job offer. There's also been a rise in moral policing. They now have introduced mandatory pregnancy tests on female national service trainees. And all these examples just show you they're a reflection of the cultural norms that are being faced in Malaysia. Arpita mentioned something in her speech earlier about how some women have it all, or can women have it all? There was an article that was circulated very widely last year. It was written by a former director of public policy in the US State Department, and it resonated with women around the world. She basically said that many women of my generation have found themselves in the prime of their careers saying no to opportunities they once would have jumped at. Many others have decided to step back for a while, taking on consultant positions. Her final statement is that you should be able to have a family if you want one, however and whenever your life circumstances allow, and still have the career you desire. If more women could strike this balance, more women would reach leadership positions. They could therefore make it easier for more women to stay in the workforce. This is something that I actually struggle with. In my work, in assuming a relatively high-profile job, and in the past I've also worked with political leaders as well. And I asked myself the question, how many women would be willing to work in my position at the pace that I'm going? Most women, when interviewed in Malaysia, and I'm not sure if this would resonate with other women as well, is that the primary reason why they would leave the workforce is to raise families because of a work-life balance and family commitments. And in Malaysia, as I showed you at the chart earlier, obviously once they start bearing children and having families, they leave the workforce and therefore are obviously not able to contribute to the cause of liberty. There are some champions in Malaysia that have gone on to talk about liberty in ways that have raised the profiles of women more than any other typically feminist movement could do. There are movements which champion electoral reform. Sisters in Islam particularly looks at the rights of women in the Islamic issues. And I think looking ahead to address the sort of concerns that I would have, meaning that even if without the cultural lens, even if women were able to enter into the workforce, how can the private sector be able to facilitate that kind of environment for working mothers? And if we can look at alternative working environments, I think this is actually the best way, where women who are in the informal sector, and this you might see all over the world, including in Malaysia, where they set up little hawker stalls, and they escape the sort of cultural lens that they have been subject to previously, and being entrepreneurs. So the entrepreneurial setups take away these original cultural biases. And finally, how liberal values would be able to influence traditional perceptions of women's roles in society. The final point is just that if women in Malaysia, as well as in many of your countries, are actually more highly educated, if they're receiving better opportunities to begin with, why is it that more than half of the population, and these are very highly educated, valuable workforce that we would like to rely on as we move the country up into better incomes and economic growth, we would want to tap into these human resources which are currently absent from the labor market. And in my country, it would be estimated between 1 to 2 million people. And if we can do that, we would eventually optimize this latent talent into moving our country and many of yours as well into higher income and higher developed nations. So thank you.